Everyone knows Alexander conquered the world. That part is not the debate. By the time he was 30, Alexander the Great had built the largest empire in ancient history. He never lost a battle. He marched his army from Macedonia to the edge of India. He outmaneuvered kings, crushed armies 3 times his size, and reshaped the entire known world in less than a decade. The history books call him great, and on the battlefield, they are not wrong. But this video is not asking whether Alexander was talented. It is asking something more precise. Today, we are going to use the Rewind History Assessment to evaluate Alexander across 7 variables: context, value, informational assessment, efficacy, commitment, effort, and overall. This scorecard does not ask what Alexander accomplished. It asks whether he was genuinely ready for what leadership required. Resistance to the idea that Alexander himself could be the problem. That resistance was not a character flaw. It was evidence of low readiness. And that distinction changes how we read everything that followed. Because a leader can conquer the world on the outside while remaining completely unready to govern what is happening on the inside. Alexander proved that too. Variable 1. Context. The first variable on the Rewind History Assessment is context. Context asks one question: did the leader actually understand the environment he was operating in? And here Alexander earns partial credit, genuine partial credit. Alexander understood the military environment with almost supernatural clarity. He could read terrain instantly. He understood cavalry positioning, infantry pressure points, and the psychological moment when an enemy line was about to break. He had studied under Aristotle. He had watched his father Philip build the most sophisticated military machine the ancient world had ever seen. By 20, he had already commanded troops in battle and won. That is real. That context was deeply understood, but leadership at the level Alexander was stepping into required a different kind of contextual awareness. Political context, cultural context, the context of governing people who did not share his language, his religion, his customs, or his definition of what civilization meant. Alexander stepped into Persia. They were the mistakes of a leader who understood how to take ground but never fully understood how to hold people. Context understood the battlefield. Context missed the civilization. Context score C. Variable 2. Value. The second variable is value. Value asks whether the leader produced something genuinely worth measuring, and the honest answer here is yes. Significantly, yes. Alexander produced extraordinary value. He spread Greek language, philosophy, art, and science across a geographic footprint that stretched from Greece to modern-day Pakistan. The cities he founded, most famously Alexandria in Egypt, became centers of learning, commerce, and cultural exchange that shaped the ancient world for centuries after his death. He opened trade routes that had never existed. He connected civilizations that had never touched. He demonstrated a model of multicultural governance that, however imperfectly executed, was centuries ahead of its time in concept. An empire that fragmented completely within a generation of his death because he had never built the institutional infrastructure that genuine readiness would have demanded. The value Alexander created was extraordinary. The value Alexander destroyed was also extraordinary, and that tension is exactly what low readiness produces at the highest levels of leadership. Value score. B. Variable 3. Informational assessment. The third variable is informational assessment. This is where Alexander's scorecard takes its most serious hit. Informational assessment asks whether the leader could accurately receive honest information, process it clearly, and act on what that information was actually telling him. Alexander could not, and the historical record on this is not subtle. Parmenion, his most experienced general, advised him repeatedly. Alexander ignored him. Eventually, he had him executed. Callisthenes, his official historian and intellectual companion, questioned the prostration demand publicly. Alexander had him imprisoned and killed. Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's oldest companions who had saved his life in battle, challenged him at a dinner. Alexander killed him with a spear in a drunken rage and then reportedly wept for days afterward. Those are not the responses of a leader with strong informational assessment. Those are the responses of a leader who had surrounded himself with a system that rewarded agreement and punished honesty, and making decisions that even his most loyal commanders could not explain. The information was always there. Alexander stopped being able to receive it. Informational assessment score, D. Variable 4, efficacy. The fourth variable is efficacy. Efficacy asks the hardest question on the scorecard. Did the leadership actually produce the intended outcome? And this is where the answer splits in two directions that history rarely holds together honestly. On the military side, the efficacy was nearly perfect. Alexander intended to conquer Persia. He conquered Persia. He intended to reach the edges of the known world. He reached them. By the narrow military definition of his stated goals, Alexander produced outcomes at a level that no leader in ancient history matched. But military conquest was never the complete goal. Alexander spoke openly. It is a personal achievement inside an institutional vacuum. Alexander produced the conquest. He never produced the empire. And the difference between those two things is exactly what readiness would have built. Efficacy score, C. Variable 5, commitment. The fifth variable is commitment. And here Alexander earns something genuine. No serious historian questions Alexander's commitment. The man marched for 11 years across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. He fought in the front lines personally, suffering serious wounds multiple times. He pushed his army past the limits of what any reasonable commander would have demanded. He refused to stop. He refused to turn back. He refused to accept the idea that any obstacle was permanent. That commitment was extraordinary. It was also, in certain moments, the most dangerous thing about him, because commitment without readiness does not produce great leadership. It produces unstoppable momentum in a direction that may be wrong. Alexander's commitment to his own vision became increasingly disconnected from the reality his army, his generals, and his empire were actually experiencing. By the time his troops finally refused to march further at the Efficacy River in India, Alexander had pushed past the boundary of what genuine leadership commitment looks like and into something that more closely resembled compulsion. His men did not refuse out of weakness. They refused because they were exhausted, homesick, and following a leader whose commitment had long since stopped accounting for anyone else's reality. Alexander had both, and by the end, the liability was winning. Commitment score, B. Variable 6, effort. The sixth variable is effort, and on this variable, the historical record leaves almost no room for debate. Alexander worked. He studied under Aristotle from age 13 to 16, absorbing philosophy, medicine, science, rhetoric, and political theory. He trained physically and militarily with relentless discipline. He planned campaigns with extraordinary detail. He studied the terrain, the enemy, the logistics, the weather, and the psychology of every opponent he faced. When he was on campaign, he slept less, marched further, fought harder, and demanded more of himself than almost any man in his army. The inability to plan beyond the next conquest, the refusal to build the institutional structures that would have given all that effort a lasting foundation. He gave everything to the campaign. He gave almost nothing to what would survive it. Effort score, B. Overall assessment. Now we can answer the central question directly. Was Alexander the Great ready to lead at 20? The answer is not yes, and it is not simply no. The honest answer is this. Alexander was ready for the part of leadership that looked like conquest. He was not ready for the part of leadership that looked like governance, succession, institutional building, and the ability to receive honest counsel without treating it as a threat. And in leadership, the second part is not optional. It is the part that determines whether what you built survives you.
Let the scorecard speak plainly. Context. C. Alexander understood the battlefield. He never fully understood the civilization he was trying to build. Value. B. The legacy was real, but so was the destruction, and a ready leader produces more of one than the other. Informational assessment. D. Alexander stopped being able to hear the truth, and a leader who cannot hear the truth cannot accurately lead anything. Efficacy. C. He conquered the world. He never built the empire. Those are two different outcomes, and only one of them required readiness, commitment. B. The commitment was genuine and extraordinary, but it eventually consumed the very people and systems it needed to succeed. Effort. B. The work was real. But effort directed through unreadiness produces exhaustion, not transformation. Overall score. C.
If you study leadership, stop measuring only the victories. Start asking whether the leader was genuinely ready for what came after the win. If you lead people today, look carefully at the difference between commitment and compulsion, between effort and readiness, between building something great and building something that lasts. They are related, but they are not the same thing. Visit the Readiness for Change Institute to learn how the Rewind History Assessment Framework applies to leaders and organizations navigating the pressure of real transformation today. The goal is not to diminish Alexander. The goal is to understand what readiness looks like, so your story ends differently than his empire did. Follow Beyond the Record for more conversations about leadership, behavior, and the evidence that history leaves behind. We will see you next time.